It's the World Cup of World Cups, episode 22, Qatar 2022.
Sunday, 20th of November 2022. Elon Musk buys GeoCities for $50 billion. Liz Truss is a surprise new campmate on I'm a Celebrity but is voted out after 10 minutes. And the World Cup of World Cups podcast hits 1 billion downloads. Meanwhile, in Doha, it'll all be kicking off. Alan wa mahabari bikum fi budcast kas alialam likas alialami. Alhalkat athaniyat walashruni kata ethnan washruni. Ismi James Cook wandaima ile kalmutad bul stafaj. Mahaban bul kaif halaki.
Mahaban.
Assalamu alaikum. We are going to the Arab world for the first time ever for the Qatar World Cup of 2022. Also joining us is proper guest, journalist and author of the award-nominated book, How to Win the World Cup. It's Nuneaton Borough fan, Chris Evans.
Hi, how you doing?
So we've got a World Cup about to start. It's in Qatar. We don't know, well, I think we know how to feel about it being in Qatar, but we don't know how to feel about the World Cup. Chris, where do you stand on it all?
I think it's two sides to it, isn't there? I mean, look, there's obviously the political side and, you know, Qatar getting the World Cup. I don't think anyone really agrees with that and everything that kind of entails. I know Sepp Blatter has come out and said that it shouldn't have gone there, but he was the one who started with the kind of taking the World Cup to all four corners of the globe. And I suppose this is kind of where we've ended up. A Winter World Cup as well, I just don't think it's got the right vibe, has it? And again, there just feels like there's not that sort of that excitement that you normally get. And I think it'd be interesting to see how it goes. I think people will still get into it because it's a World Cup, but I think it's going to be a bit more of a slow burner. And I think if England disappoint, then it could be a bit of a damp squib. But, you know, I mean, from my side, you know, it is still a World Cup. And actually, you know, tournaments are great. And, you know, any time of year, while it might not be the same as being in the summer, I think once it gets going, I think the football is going to be something that we're all going to be enjoying.
It's going to be a really weird one because obviously they could have taken it to parts of the Arab world that are big football nations anyway.
But then you've got somewhere like Morocco, which for about 40 years wanted to host the World Cup every single time, never won a vote, and now they don't want to do it at all. Chris, do you think that nations don't want to host the World Cup anymore?
I think the South Africa experience, and actually to a point Brazil as well, have scared off a few nations. I mean, look, there's still the grandeur of it, but I think that we were, say, victims. We had the sort of legacy chat, didn't we, in 2012 with the Olympics. And I think that this idea of legacy now and actually being an intangible thing that gets more people playing sport or playing football, actually that's proved that there's not an awful lot there. I mean, I know one of the stadiums in Brazil that was built is now used as a multi-story car park. So that kind of says it all about legacies and building things in different places that don't have the same audience and the same, you know, football fans there to capture. And I think people are more cautious of that and spending that money on bringing something in that brings a sort of short-term hit. I do think there is a move now about actually people saying, well, what is a legacy of a World Cup? What do you actually want to achieve from it? And having something and real targets and knowing what an area can gain from it. And I think that it could change again, but I think there is a bit of reticence to spend money for something when they don't actually know what the output's going to be at the moment.
So basically, in the future, it's always going to be in an oil-rich Arab state, because they're the only ones who've got any money.
We always try, don't we? Over here, we're always kind of throwing a hat into the ring for everything. I mean, I guess the benefit of being in the UK, France, Germany, you know, Spain, the same, you know, the infrastructure is closer to being there than some of these other places. So it's not kind of like building everything from the ground up.
Yeah, if you already have 10 stadiums that are over 50,000 seater, there's no need to actually build any. I mean, because the American one in America, Mexico, Canada in 26, they will probably break the records for biggest attendances for some of these teams because they're playing in university stadiums that have 100,000, 140,000 seats in some of these places.
And particularly with FIFA demanding so much from each nation that hosts, unless that gets reformed, you can't see other nations, people like Morocco, wanting to host the World Cup because it's going to cost them an arm and a leg and they get absolutely nothing back from it. Personally, if I was the kind of football fan who went to tournaments, I would not go to this tournament. And I think what I would like for this tournament is, and I'm going to watch it on TV. I'm not buying any of the merch. I'm not doing any of that. I don't want to watch any travelogues about, Qatar's rich history and anything like that. I want to watch the games, and ideally I want to watch them in echoey, empty stadiums because everyone's boycotting it. Yeah. But I don't think that's going to happen.
I think it's a shame for Wales in a sense because it's the first World Cup they've got to since the 50s. It's not a summer World Cup, but it's also in Qatar that's not the best place for a World Cup. And actually, while we're seeing all these things about where people are staying and these little huts that have been created for fans, I think a lot of fans are actually going to watch a game and then be shuttled back out to the likes of Bahrain because I don't think there's enough space. And I think that's their way of dealing with it. They've built these big, fast trains to get you in and out of the country for the matches. So I think it's going to be an all-round quite a strange experience.
Yeah, there's lots of people who went over for like Wales in 2016 for the Euros and were like, we went to Lille. It was amazing. We stayed there as our base, but we went out to the different places and engaged with the fans there, engaged with the locals. I don't think that's going to be possible in Qatar in the same way, or even in any sort of way.
No, I mean, I'm sure they'll put on a good show. Look, money will allow you to do that. And I'm sure that, just like Russia did, everyone was saying how good the Russian World Cup was in 2018. And obviously we know what's happened in the following 4 years. People can put on good tournaments. I mean, you want to go too far back to the 30s, you can see what happened with the Olympics, right? So these things can happen. I'm sure it'll be a good tournament. It's just whether morally it's the right thing.
Football is sometimes annoyingly amoral, and the context it finds itself in doesn't really have an effect on the quality of the games, which is the problem, because I love football and I love the World Cup, and I don't want the World Cup to be in Qatar. But we're way past that.
There was a time to take it away, and that was probably when the first reports of deaths came out. You could have taken it away then, but instead they went, no, double down on it.
Let's talk instead about how to win the World Cup, which coincidentally, Chris, is the name of your book. Is it nominated for an award? Is that right?
It was part of Waterstones had a sports books of 2022. It's not an award. I think it's just they picked out some that they think are good. And I assume that it's just World Cup. It's a good time for them to be pushing it as well.
That sounds like an award to me, mate.
As comedians who've written blurb for the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, that's award-winning.
Yeah, I think it's been quite a competitive field this year with football books in particular, because I think I did most of my work during the COVID lockdown. I think there's a few that have kind of come out. So Rory Smith and Jonathan Wilson have got books out. They're two heavyweights, and perhaps in previous years you look at the ones who came out and there wasn't those sort of big names in those years. So I think it's. For any real award chance, I think it's probably the wrong time for that. But if I get on a long list somewhere, that'd be great in the future. Who knows?
Well, we can exclusively announce, Chris, that you are the winner of the World Cup of World Cups Book of the Year 2022, which is a real award that we just came up with.
Which is annoying because both me and James have written books. I'm going to nominate James's 101 Board Games to Play Before You Die, and James is going to nominate mine, which is called But Doctor I Am, a collection of comic strips by Paul Savage, and we sadly lose to Chris Evans's How to Win the World Cup.
Yes.
I think it can work as a monthly thing. I mean, November, December, I can have it. Obviously, then board games, perfect for January. So it's all good.
Chris, you are now the expert on how to win the World Cup. So, based on your findings, who is going to win the 2022 World Cup?
I mean, there's two answers to it. So if you'd asked me this at the start of this year, I'd be sitting here not just because I'm an Englishman and say, England have got a really good chance because their trajectory is very similar to the trajectory of other recent winners. Their methods and Gareth Southgate's methods are similar to that. However, I think it does feel as though there has been a bit of a change, whether it's just an external perception of how things have gone, but it feels that the whole dynamic and the whole conversations around it, whether that's just adding pressure. So I'm not going to pick England anymore. So, I mean, beyond that, I think it's going to be a really, really open competition. I think especially because it's in the winter, in the way that it is, it's a different dynamic with no preparation. But I think there are no standout candidates Because even when you look at Argentina and you look at their run, they've played one top European nation in about 4 years. And I think that, and the same for Brazil, that's going to be a big issue for them. And I think they've not tested themselves against those sides. And I think the power sits within Europe now, and there's not been a non-European winner since 2002. So I kind of think it's going to stay that way. So I would probably, if I had to pick one, I'd probably go for Spain, based on the fact that they've come close a couple of times. They probably should have been Italy at the Euros last year. Another time could have actually won that competition. And for what it's worth, got to the final of the Nations League as well and lost to France. So I think maybe their next cab off the block, if you like, that kind of show that they're building to something. And that seems to be what international teams do, that they kind of develop until they kind of peak at that top and win a World Cup.
Do you think France are going to self-destruct as they have so often in previous years?
I did another podcast and they asked about biggest underachievers, and I did say, or biggest disappointment, and I did say France. I think they should. I mean, 4 of the last 5 winners have failed to get out of the next group stage, and I think because of their group, I think they ought to get out of the group, but I actually think they might struggle when they get to the knockouts. Maybe they'll play a real team like England, who knows? But I have a feeling that they might not be as strong as they are. And you look at the squad that's been announced, despite their embarrassment of riches, they look really short in midfield now, relatively short to what they were beforehand. And I think injuries, as well as, coming in form-wise, their form's been pretty wretched for the last 18 months as well. And I think it's very insular, international football, because we tend to look at our own nation and say, England aren't doing very well, they've not done this, but there's a lot of big nations who have not had it their own way over the past 18 months as well. And France, behind England, are definitely one of those that don't look that they're in good form coming into the tournament.
And looking at the group that the French are in, they're with Denmark and Australia again, just like they were 4 years ago, and Tunisia. France have never lost to an Asian team, but their group record against Denmark, this is the 4th time they'll play in the groups, and they're 1-1, drawn 1, lost 1 with them. And their record against African teams is 1-3, lost 3. They actually have a bit of a dodgy record against African teams. So maybe Tunisia, I suppose, are the nation in that group you'd be looking to deliver that surprise if France are to continue this trend of winners crashing out in the first round. Yeah,
potentially. I mean, I do think they'll probably have too much and get through. I don't actually think they'll win that group. I think Denmark will win that group. And partly because, Denmark, they have some sort of hold over France, don't they, like you say? So I kind of think France might come second in that group. And I think there's going to be a lot of shocks in this tournament, but I also can see, if you look at the groups and the way they are, I think that a lot of the bigger nations probably will make it through by hook or by crook. And I kind of think that there could be, similar to 2018, that there could be a split where there's going to be a really strong half of the draw and then another side where there's only 1 or 2 of your kind of traditional elite nations. And I think if the winner of England's group could well go into that easier side of the draw based on what's there. So, there are green shoots. I don't know what I'm trying to talk myself into, England having a chance here, but there are things there.
Well, let's talk about this. Which big teams do you think are likely to crash out early?
France, obviously there. So Germany are another's that I would look at. They've got Spain in their group. And I think that Germany, for all they've got, I think they're at the start. International football, you end up in quite a long transition, much longer than the club game. And I feel as though Germany are in that transition. On paper, because they've got that sort of Bayern Munich thread that goes through, they should have an advantage, but their form hasn't been great. It feels like it's perhaps a little bit too soon for them. I think they're probably going to click at some stage, and maybe, this World Cup is it. But I would look at it and say, they've got one of the harder groups. And if they struggle against Spain in that opening match, I think that could be an issue for them. There's a few as you go, and I think there's going to be one that you completely don't expect. And you look at how Argentina have played and the form they've got coming in. But actually, as we know with football, as soon as that form drops off, it can be catastrophic. So if they had an unlucky defeat, how would they react to that?
Yeah, Argentina drawn with Mexico and Poland and Saudi Arabia. Mexico seemingly always get to the second round and then lose. And then Poland have Lewandowski, and if he starts firing, which he hasn't done at a major tournament yet, really, And of course, Poland have a 100% record in World Cup games when they score the first goal.
Yeah, I mean, I do think Argentina will get out. I do think a lot of these elite nations will get out of their group, just because I think that there is a bigger gap. I think we're going to see more shock results, but like I say, I think they're going to. I would be surprised if too many dropped out in the group stage, but I do think it's after that where you're going to start seeing a real sort of mixed bag.
Which of these groups would you say is the group of death this year?
I mean, I would say Germany, Spain, by the fact that you've got there. If you're looking at two strong nations in the same group, that's got to be the strongest. So yeah, I would perhaps look at them, because if they take points from the other, then because of the way that the groups work, if you lose one game, you're under the cosh straight away, and it then becomes a little bit more random, and there's a chance that you could batter a team and not beat them, and then all of a sudden you're out of the tournament. So I would say that's
yeah, because Costa Rica and Japan both are actually strong sides. Costa Rica were the absolute underdogs for the year that they were with three former champions in Uruguay, Italy and England, and then won that group handily.
Yeah, and I think also you look at it last World Cup, you wouldn't have called South Korea beating Germany. There's always a chance.
Statistically, according to the FIFA World Rankings, of course, the hardest group is Group B, England, Iran, USA and Wales, because all of those nations are in the top 20.
Yeah, and I think that could be tough. Tough for England in particular, because I think they struggle to break teams down, as we saw against Hungary twice. It doesn't go well when teams just sit in, and England will always give chances away to other teams too. And I think that's a concern, especially playing Iran first, because Carlos Queiroz in particular is a very well-organised, he'll have a well-drilled side, and they'll be hard to break down. And, I can see England not winning that opening game or drawing 0-0, and I think that, like I say, with Germany and Spain, that suddenly puts a lot of pressure on. So if you don't achieve that, and then you're kind of knowing you've got the US are really going to want to get one over England, and then you've got Wales, which is kind of like that Scotland game in the Euros becomes not so much kind of like a tournament game as a kind of like a grudge match. I think that could be England's problem, and I do think they're not going to like swat aside these teams as some people seem to think.
That Iran game is absolutely crucial, and bearing in mind it's in the middle of the day in the desert, and it's 8 days after the last Premier League games, and Iran will be really up for it. And as you say, it's Queiroz, so they'll be organised. And the worry is England will show up acting like they're going to win and then come unstuck. Iran were 10-1 to win that game, and that looks like free money to me.
I mean, it's worth putting a couple of quid on, isn't it? I think, just in case. I mean, you can definitely see it, can't you? Like, Iran get an early goal, like Iceland. They could get an early goal, and England just don't lay a glove on them almost, and just can't get past them. And sadly, I think that's more of a problem. I'd be more worried about games like that for England than I am actually against some of these bigger sides coming up.
With that in mind, we're recording this before Southgate is announcing his squad, so we don't know the final makeup of his squad. But in order to win the World Cup, Chris, what shouldn't you do in terms of putting a squad together?
Well, especially this year when there's no kind of pre-tournament friendlies, it's trying to reinvent the wheel. And I mean, that doesn't mean, we don't know what's going to happen with James Maddison, but I think for 26, you'd perhaps take a wild card in there, although it looks as though he's not going to. I do think that in international football, you need consistency. And some of the interviews in the book kind of said that as well, that you can't keep swapping your players around, and because you don't get as much time with them, you need to have that consistent, not just for tactics but also the culture, so you kind of know the environment that you're going to go into. And I think Southgate's very, very good at that, and people kind of say he's over loyal, and there are certain question marks over the likes of Harry Maguire, but whether Maguire should start, he probably will, but he should probably almost certainly be in that 26 because he is a leader and a key player within that squad in the past. So he's right for that, but whether you'd want to see him starting based on the lack of form he's got, I mean, that's another question, isn't it, I think? As much as Southgate needs to, I mean, there's a lot of, in international manager, there's a lot of soft skills. So you can't do loads of tactical stuff. You can't change things really quickly. So if we know he prefers playing with a back five, he'll probably play with a back five. He tried a back four in the Nations League. I think it was a back four against Hungary at Molineux when they lost 4-0. So I'd be very surprised if we see that back again. I think it's not as sophisticated. International football isn't as sophisticated, but that means that it kind of has that sort of purity that the club game doesn't get, because I think club game is so choreographed. And, you've got the likes of Guardiola and Klopp, who every little play and sequence, they've kind of been through this. And that's brilliant, but you just cannot do that at international level. So I think it's consistency, succinct communication, and kind of making sure you're building confidence within your guys as well. And especially when you're a leading nation and you're likely to have a press at home that's going to criticise you.
So should you take injured players and players who are massively out of form?
So out of form, no. I mean, look, I did say about Maguire. It's, as a person, he's worth having there. I think there's got to be question marks over Jordan Henderson for the same way that he's not. Doesn't feel like he's at the same level he's been. However, again, he's another leader. He's someone who perhaps should have come on sooner in the Euro 2020 final and kind of settled it. And that's where he's not a starter, but that's his benefit, his experience of being in there and having won big games before. Should you look at players who are injured? I think the 26, the extended squad, that allows you to. There was a good interview, so I spoke to both Roberto Martinez and Graham Jones, who obviously took Vincent Kompany in 2018 with Belgium, and he got injured in those warm-up games, but they decided he had to be there. Because even if he didn't get to play, he was their captain. He was the guy who was the link between the manager, like the managers and the coaches and the players. And actually, he came through and he played in the knockouts and he scored against Brazil, I think. And, he was brilliant as they kind of got to the semi-finals. It was vindicated. And I think there is a point that if the person has enough, you can get away with it. I mean, even when in the days of 23 players, Sven spoke about taking Theo Walcott. Said actually playing number 23 isn't going to win you the World Cup, but he could give you something different. I mean, actually, he went to such an extent that he went too far with picking Theo probably. But, the theory is there. And this is why, Maddison would seem to be sure to talk about, tactics. Does he fit into this? He's not played for 3 years. He's got one cap. But, for 26 players, you can spare a spot for a bit of a wild card pick.
So you mentioned the interviews you did there with Martinez. Loads of interviews in the book with managers and coaches, not only of teams that have qualified for the World Cup, but also of teams that, frankly, have no chance of ever qualifying for the World Cup. talking about how they're trying to build towards something. Of the managers you interviewed, was there anyone there who surprised you?
Roberto Martinez is really good. I mean, I know Roberto Martinez is quite thoughtful, very thorough. But actually what surprised me was that before he'd even become an international manager, before he got any intention of it, he'd done kind of in-depth studies on World Cup nations and the sort of things they do and, actually what the balance is like for that camp. And that was a real insight of how much detail these guys go into. And this is a guy who was managing, first time he went to the World Cup, he was managing Wigan, then he was managing Everton. And you kind of think, well, wow, this guy is kind of trying to get information from everyone. And that was quite revealing. I think there was one line in the interview I did with Luis Felipe Scolari as well. And I asked him about, that semi-final in 2014 and losing 7-1. And I said to him, look, what would you have done? What would you have changed if you had your time again? Because you think 7-1, it was a national embarrassment. And he said, nothing. He said, if I had my time again, I'd do exactly the same thing again. And his justification was actually quite sound, I guess. He said that it was a one in 1,000 game, I think he called it. And he said, Germany were better, but 7-1, wouldn't happen again. He says it was just a case that of that moment, it just kind of came together. And again, to show the point of how much information these guys focus on, he knew he hadn't got Neymar, he hadn't got Thiago Silva, so he hadn't got his two main players. So that wasn't going to change. And he says he made his decisions based on all the facts and the data they'd done. And he said they'd been so thorough that information would have led them to make those same decisions again. So it was the sort of thing, I know it becomes a football cliche, but there's almost kind of like a trust the process going on there. And I mean, the process ended up with a 7-1 defeat, but I think it was quite interesting that he had that mindset,
It just makes it sound like he's never watched it back.
Perhaps he hasn't.
Really? You're gonna stick with this?
I mean, I spoke to Otmar Hitzfeld not for a world. Well, he is in this book, but I spoke to him about that Champions League final in 1999, and he says he still hasn't watched that back either. So perhaps Big Phil's the same. Perhaps in his head, he thinks the three of them were offside. One was a handball, and Brazil were.
They were lucky, Germany, in that game.
Yeah,
they got a lucky 4 goals in 6 minutes. We've been doing this podcast since what feels like the dawn of time now.
Yeah.
And part of it is working out which World Cup was the best. So Paul and I, we now know which World Cup is the best because we've done the whole series. So Chris, what's your favourite World Cup? Which of the World Cups fits your sort of platonic ideal for perfection?
It depends on age, doesn't it? So age is obviously a big thing, and also when your first World Cup was. So my first World Cup that I remember watching was France '98. I was probably old enough just to remember the USA one, but if the games were at the wrong time, England went on, so they just wasn't on at home. But yeah, France '98, I was into football then, and that was brilliant. But I kind of think that it's that sort of first cut being the deepest sort of vibes, and I think everyone always got that.
One of the things that we found from doing this is that the best World Cup is the one that was when you were 10 years old. And so we've had to factor that into people's accounts of why this one was the best.
Yeah, so I actually was bang on for that. So I was 10 in the summer of '98. So, there you go.
Just to let you know, Chris, 1998 France was actually the 5th best World Cup of all time.
Was it? Don't shatter my dreams. I mean, I think the last World Cup was really good. I felt, there were a lot of storylines. There were a lot of goals. It felt like there were a lot of countries going in there. And, England getting to a semi-final, I mean, this must be another factor. So if England do well, your country does well, that also has an effect. Yes, it was the last World Cup. Yes, it was in Russia. But I really enjoyed the last World Cup for what it was. And actually, even in the time that I've been watching England, I never actually thought that I think I'd decided it was never actually going to happen that I'd see us in the semi-final of a World Cup. So that was quite significant. And then actually to go again and get to a final. And this is why I'm probably a bit of a Southgate sympathiser, because he's given me those moments that I never thought that we'd get. And I think you can be a bit blinded by that perhaps, but that's why he's got my heart. I think that's where we're at with it. Although, people can let you down. So maybe that's
yeah. And according to the stats, he's the 2nd most successful England manager of all time. And God, 20 years ago, we'd have loved to have got to a semi-final and a final when we were going out in quarterfinals and second rounds and
dropping out the groups and not qualifying for the Euros, which happened, within the last 12, 13 years.
2008 was it?
I could actually tell you the exact day we lost to Croatia in that qualifier. It was November 21st, 2007, which is the day my daughter was born. And coincidentally, the 21st of November is the day England play Iran, because that's happening on her 15th birthday.
Oh, nice.
Well, let's hope it doesn't come up again. But yeah, I remember the Sun had the front page of their newspaper after that was a deflated football in a gutter with an England side, and that was quite a striking image. Shows they got the front page right that time, if it kind of sticks in my mind. And I just hope that we don't see that again. But yeah, 2018 and 1998, and I think looking back at other tournaments, I mean, it's difficult because you look at it very different. And I know, football's a weird one because something could have happened 2 years before you got into football, and it feels like it was a different decade ago, doesn't it? And that's quite difficult. So it's difficult to really judge the tournaments prior to that, I think, for me.
Russia 2018 is 7th. I thought that was going to be higher as well.
Turns out it's just horrible human rights does take it out of you. It does lose your points.
Yeah. All the alleged bribery and corruption.
Yeah,
in fact,
absolutely.
They are the most recent World Cups that are in the top 10 of our chart. The number 1 World Cup is Mexico 1986. It fulfills all the things we want from a World Cup, it turns out. So it's got the controversy, it's got the shocks, and it's also got memorable moments, incredible goals, incredible games. I mean, it just so happens to be the World Cup from when I was 9. But I just point out, I didn't decide. I'm part of it, but I didn't decide that.
Well, it's got Maradona as well, hasn't it? And I think that's actually something that perhaps more recent World Cups lack, is that real sort of star. And obviously we have the superstars, and I know Messi relatively controversially won the player of the tournament, didn't he, in 2014.
How he beat James Rodriguez to that is quite frankly baffling. I mean, he was amazing in the groups, but then knockouts less so.
There is a point though of it seems to your nation has to get to a semi-final or a final to be in to win that. And I know actually Ili Dimitrescu mentioned that with Romania in '94, that he said, if they got to that semi-final, Hadji would have been player of the tournament, but because they went out on penalties in the quarters, that was it for them.
So what are your favourite sort of iconic World Cup moments, Chris?
I mean, there's different sides, right? So you've got, Maradona kind of stands out. He was brilliant. And then the fact that they kind of got to the final again. And I quite enjoyed the idea that the way that Argentina managed to do that was because Bilardo didn't celebrate that World Cup win, and actually instead he got really upset in '86 because they conceded 2 goals to West Germany in the final from corners, and they'd kind of drilled that. And I think it's a real essence from the book as well to show what it takes to win again. And it's that sort of Roy Keane mentality, isn't it? Almost that you don't celebrate what's next,
and then just leave after swearing at everyone.
Yeah. But I think Maradona is that's an iconic moment, and you still see when Maradona kind of comes up. And I think when you look back at tournaments further back, I think, you got to go England 66, right? And Jeff Hurst hat trick. And he, talking to him actually, the book was really good as well. He was kind of, I'm sure he loves talking about, and it's probably spoken about every day since 66. But, it was funny because he said that the moment got to him when he scored one of the goals and he did like a funny little jump. And he said he made himself look like an idiot doing that jump. If you watch it back, you see that was funny because you kind of look at it and you're like, you scored a hat-trick in the World Cup and you're still telling people decades on about this little jump. And I looked at it, I hadn't really thought about it, but he flagged it. I've seen it, and I can see why he might have been a bit embarrassed.
He could have done literally anything after any of those goals, and none of us would care.
Yeah, look, he's a hero, and he's a legend, and he was great to chat to, and he, hearing about what it was like for him back then was really good.
Did he mention that obviously that England weren't favourites for that World Cup? He
said that the World Cup still wasn't really a huge deal at the start of that tournament. They were kind of closeted away, and they stayed in Lilleshall for it. So they were kind of away from all kind of like the fervour as it built. But he said, England had only first gone to a World Cup in 1950, and that hadn't gone well. And England hadn't really, they hadn't really grasped it. And it came to that World Cup, and they wanted to win. And you kind of look actually in the 60s, there was still European Cups were still quite a relative novelty still at that time for British clubs. So that's when they started to win them, and I think there wasn't the same sort of feel about it. So no, they weren't favourites, and there wasn't loads of expectation. Although obviously, winning it that was it. Then it then became the most important thing in the world, and has remained so. So that was quite interesting. I mean, every single tournament going through it, there were always iconic moments. So 1970, you've got that great Brazilian team. 82. You've got Italy coming out of nowhere and just suddenly exploding and winning. And that's a really good example of loyalty because, Enzo Bearzot kept the faith with Paolo Rossi, and Rossi himself kind of, what I did an interview for him, we get some quotes from it. He'd said, I expected to be dropped, but having that confidence and that backing allowed me to do what I did. So
is that you suggesting that Harry Maguire is going to be the top scorer in this World Cup then?
I think
with all of his goals coming in the semi and the final.
I'd say keep playing. This is where it is, because you can always find threads and say, okay, well, this shows you it's positive to say that you can lose a semi-final and a final and go on to win. But then you've got the Dutch side of the 70s that lost 2 finals and never won. So, you can always pick apart arguments. It's one of those. You give me someone who's, Paolo Rossi has suddenly exploded and scored lots of goals and won the tournament. You'll see somebody else who's made a horrible mistake and shouldn't have been picked in the first place. So it's one of those, and you kind of pick out what you want. You know what it's as a journalist, you tell your story based on the evidence that you want to kind of show. And I think that's the same with the pragmatism stuff as well that I've done before.
There's a thing that I've noticed with commentators where they say a thing that they think would be interesting to happen. They really want to hammer that narrative whilst it's still happening. I was watching Liverpool Spurs the other day, and Liverpool were 2-0 up at half-time, but Spurs have been really good in second halves this year. And so Martin Tyler was constantly banging on, oh, here's second half Spurs, they've got a goal back, here's the comeback and then it didn't happen. And he was quite disappointed. Partly, I think, because it didn't prove his own narrative that he then gets to look like a really smart guy who's predicted it. Is that a thing as a journalist that you look at and go, I need to not make trying to prove my own point the most important bit?
I guess it's in all of life, normalise changing your opinion, right? I always look at it as long as you can justify why you've said something and why you have that opinion, then that's enough. And actually, if you're right or wrong, fine. But as long as it's not just kind of like something you've plucked out of the air. And I think this is where kind of finding that evidence and actually the pragmatism thing, people will always counter that. And I'd kind of said, well, look at almost all of the past winners, with the exception of 2 or 3. And they've always been led by a pragmatist. And that isn't exciting, it isn't sexy, but that's international football and tournaments. But people will obviously come back and say, okay, well, X, Y, Z, they were all kind of pragmatic and went out in the groups and they didn't score enough goals. And you're like, right, you're right. It's as long as the thread is there. And with Tyler, obviously there is the thread with Spurs, with the pragmatism. These countries have still been pragmatic and won it, even if there have been pragmatic nations that have failed. And, there's one winner every 4 years, so you can't always be right.
It's almost as if all football supporters, whether they work in it, part of the football media, or just like watching it, will always retrospectively impose a narrative on the chaos that has ensued.
Yeah.
All right, having said all that, let's make some crazy predictions that, if they turn out to be right, will make us look like geniuses, but 99% of the time will just make us look like idiots. What are your crazy predictions?
Denmark to go deep into the tournament. I think they're the ones, in terms of the outside of the established elite, that I think will go on. And I think it's possible that there could be more than just one of the non-established elite that kind of get there. I think we could see a tournament a little bit like 2002, where there are shocks all over the shop. And I think it's really difficult for a World Cup to pick out shocks, because you look at it and you think, oh, well, that country's so far better. But you look at how many times Italy as holders going out of a group with Paraguay, New Zealand and Slovakia. And you kind of look at that and you think, well, how on earth did the holders of the World Cup go out of that group? That should have been a gimme. So it's really difficult to pick exactly what it is, but I think there will be more surprises than a regular World Cup, probably. I think you are going to probably have one of those same group of countries will win, because they always do. And actually, Croatia getting to a final last time was significant in itself, and whether we'll get another nation that gets the final kind of from that sort of outside of that elite is interesting. So yeah, but I'd certainly say Denmark to the semi-finals. I'd say you could end up with a real sort of outside pick being a top goal scorer. For that reason, I don't have a name, but I think that, again, you look at it and I think the way that goals are scored and not knowing which country is going to win, I think it could be a bit more like a Grand National pick of who's going to be top goal scorer this time. It could be carnage, and it could be that just someone hits at the right time and, wins it with 4 goals or something. So I'm going to say, as a real kind of like outside pick, Harry Maguire and Gareth Southgate to be on the Queen's honours. The Queen's shit. On the King's.
So you're saying that there's going to be such a crisis of succession that we'll have a new Queen within the time of the World Cup.
And it's going to be Gareth Southgate and Harry Maguire. No, I think they're going to be on the King's honours list as a real sort of outsider that they kind of show. Gareth will get knighted. Maguire will just get kind of like one of the other honours. I don't think he'll get knighted. But I think that's a real outside pick, because that's a possibility, I suppose. If England did hook it up and actually ended up winning, it could happen. And the country would probably love that sort of jubilation. So we'd have to be, we'd get behind everyone and make sure everyone was properly rewarded. I think the Iranians were all bought new houses after they beat the US in 98. So I don't think these guys nowadays need new houses, do they? But
buy them a street in Lilleshall that they can all live on.
Yeah.
Like
so honours is the only thing that we can give, I'd imagine. So
I reckon, this is my crazy prediction, Portugal won't get out of the group. That's my crazy prediction. I think, in fact, in doing so, they will not win a game. I can see them doing something daft, like drawing 3 times.
All right, I think that's plausible. Here's my crazy prediction. You ready for this? If this comes off, I'm going to look like such a genius. Brazil won't get out of the groups.
Ooh.
Wow.
Because they've got to play Serbia and Switzerland again. And I just got a feeling. I just got a feeling they won't win either of those games.
Yeah.
I mean, Brazil don't look as though they're as balanced, everyone says. They seem to be very front-weighted. So if you can stop them scoring, I think you could probably score against them. Perhaps there's a chance.
They will rue the day they didn't pick Douglas Luiz.
Other crazy prediction, I think that Canada will be one of Belgium or Croatia in the group. That's my crazy prediction.
Yeah.
Crazy prediction.
No Alphonso Davies. He limped off, didn't he, the weekend? So
Yeah.
Is he out?
Yeah,
Is
so
he out of the World Cup?
I'm not sure whether he's fully out, but he's not looking. He's one of these race against times. I'm sure he's whichever part of his anatomy is hurt will be on the front pages of Canadian papers getting prayed for, probably. So
metatarsals on the Vancouver Sun.
It'd be a good name for a prog rock album. Just finally, what would your ideal World Cup scenario be for Qatar 2022?
It'll be brilliant. There'll be goals everywhere. The tournament will go without a hitch, I guess, first and foremost. That's the most important thing. And I hope that some of the people that will go and protest will not be treated as badly as it suggests they might do. And I hope it goes as well as we can, considering the situation that we're in. I hope there's loads of goals. I hope England win. It would be nice if Wales could get out of the group as well. That's probably really condescending. But yeah, it'd be really nice to kind of, the home nations to do well. And I think just for there to be excitement and a bit of escapism, because it's a Winter World Cup and people aren't there for it, and it's not a great time at the moment I know not just in this country but all around the world, isn't it? And I think I think football has that sort of power, and I think that's what you want: excitement and something that gets you out of your seat, and England to win.
If I could pick what I would love to happen at the end of this, is that Qatar go far enough that it sparks a revolutionary fervour in the Qatari people, and they overthrow this horrible government that they've got and put in a lovely socialist Republic of Narnia. And that is done by somehow England beating them on the way to the final. Somehow I think this is even less likely to get Canada beating Belgium.
No, well, I did speak to a manager who, he did ask me not to name him, but a guy who has worked in Qatar, and he said to me a couple of years ago, not a chance will they do well. He says they're just not good enough. I trust what he was saying. Yeah, I don't think they're going to do particularly well. I think South Africa were probably stronger, and they were the only country that's failed to get out of the group stage. And I think, I don't, unfortunately for Qatar, I don't see it going too well for them on the pitch. But you never know.
Well, yeah, exactly. We never know.
Yeah.
And that's why we will watch the games, despite all the misgivings we may have about the existence of this World Cup. Chris Evans, thank you so much for coming and chat to us today. The book is How to Win the World Cup, Secrets and Insights from International Football's Top Managers, and it's available from, everywhere?
So it's in Waterstone stores. Amazon is probably the quickest deliverer of it as well online. So obviously knowing the World Cup is nice and close. And obviously, as we know, it was one of their picks for the best sports books of 2022. So,
and is award-winning because it's the World Cup of World Cup's best book of 2022.
That's endorsement enough.
If you are one of our core listeners who've been with us since 1930, listening to this, you will absolutely love this book. It's full of all kinds of not only sort of the footballing insights, but also the great bits of football trivia and things about World Cup history that we've been covering on this World Cup. So it's a perfect accompaniment to this podcast. Make sure you get yourself a copy. If you have been listening to this entire series, remember, we would love it if you rated and reviewed this podcast on wherever you get your podcasts from. You can email us still, worldcupofworldcups@gmail.com, and support us at ko-fi.com/World Cup of World Cups. Thanks to everyone who's done that so far.
It has been so nice that people have texted me out of the blue saying, I've just been listening to random episode and it's really interesting and funny. And it's just been really lovely getting those messages. So thanks for everyone who sent those.
Yeah, if you've got Paul's mobile number, just bombard him with text messages about the podcast for a little bit. So this kind of brings our series to an end. But if I were you, I'd keep the feed open. There may be some surprises coming in the next few weeks. So thank you very much for listening to the World Cup of World Cups podcast. I'm at James E. Cook.
I'm at Comedy Savage.
And I'm at Chris Evans Wright.
Until we meet again, Ma'al Salama.
Ma'al Salama.